hello, I'm Howard Denson with Writer to Writer and with Arthur Rosenfeld today. And he is a graduate of Yale University, has attended Cornell, University of California, and is the author of many books. And he is noted for dealing with magical realism in fiction. Would you define what you mean by magical realism?
I just mean when impossible things happen to ordinary people. And I don't necessarily mean that the plot depends on something outrageous or impossible. It can just be small things in the background.
Okay. Now, can you give an example of that, or perhaps from your reading of
Yeah. In my novel, A Cure for Gravity, two motorcyclists who are on independent cross-country courses meet in the Oklahoma Panhandle. But they don't just meet on the road, they meet in a tornado, which sucks them both aloft, and they literally meet in the air.
Okay.
And they fall into a corn silo, and they manage to survive this ordeal with their bikes intact and so on. I've been in a little tiny twister in the Oklahoma Panhandle on a motorcycle, which gave me the idea. But of course, probably an Oklahoman would call it a dirt devil.
Okay.
So that's magical in the sense that it would be unlikely to be possible to survive that, really.
Oh.
You could be sucked up by a twister riding a bike, but you would probably not be set down unharmed. So that's an example from one book.
Okay. With the magical realism, that seems to harken back to what Wordsworth and Coleridge were doing. They were looking at bringing kind of magic out of the commonplace at one hand, and then in a more dramatic fashion with the other one on that too. So your interest in, I know, the martial arts, I was reading your webpage about that, kind of lends you towards looking for more than just what's present in life, I would assume.
Yes, the martial arts for me are of greater interest as a spiritual path than as a tool for knocking heads in the bar. I find that the deeper I go with meditative and martial practice, the clearer it becomes to me that we actually have no idea what's going on. Mm-hmm. And more than that we're very limited by our senses. And for example, if a bat were hanging from one of the lights up here and listening to this conversation, what the bat would hear going on in this room would create an entirely different perception of the world than what we can hear. So the hum of the lights above us, fluorescence outside, the winding of TV cameras and various buzzing of electronics would create a world totally different from the one that you and I are focused on now, just voices. Mm-hmm. And so that tells us that on the most prosaic level, our perceptions color what we think is going on, what's around us. And magical realism, introducing an element of the fantastical into fiction, not writing a fantasy novel. And the distinction I make here is a very simple one. In a fantasy novel, the entire realm of play is imaginary, and impossible things are integral to the movement of the plot. In magical realism, that's not the case. It's an everyday, recognizable, familiar environment in which suddenly something impossible happens. And it should be somewhat jarring to the reader, but not so jarring as to cause a suspension, the suspension of disbelief to go away, or the seamless dream to end. But jarring enough to make the reader squint and go, and pay closer, not lesser attention. The idea being to remind the reader that what you think you're seeing here, all the different levels of things going on, may not be exactly what's going on. So in a sense, it's a tool. It's a literary tool.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you're looking at the world, using all of the senses, do you go through a phase of paring things down to certain senses, or do you open it up simultaneously to all of them as you're doing your writing or you're thinking about writing and stuff?
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. The process of writing for me, because I have the attention span of a flea in heat, requires tomb-like silence. If a cricket passes wind in an adjoining room, I forget where I was. So the result is I wear earplugs, and I have a white noise generator or an air cleaner going, and a bomb can go off next door and I don't hear it. And I am totally in the world and in the page. As far as my characters and descriptions, I try to consciously employ different sensory information for the reader. But actually, over the years, I've found that I no longer really need to think about doing that consciously, because when I'm in the scene, I'm smelling it and tasting it and seeing it and hearing it naturally, unconsciously, and that comes out in my prose. Although I think it's fair to say that I'm pretty much mostly visual.
Okay. I was reading one of your books, and I noticed a very crisp dialogue that you had in there. Moved it along, and I'm old enough to remember old-time radio, the very good dialogue and the voices that you were hearing. What's your writing process to let things such as that emerge?
I try to keep dialogue to one line. I don't always do that. But as a guideline, I don't feel that in real life people sit and expound as we are doing here in their exchanges. On the other hand, I'm also aware that there's really nothing about fiction that needs to be that close to real life. The only danger is to ring falsely to the ear, to the reader's ear. And I can tell you that accents and the cadence of speech was something that I was aware of as a little boy. I would be keenly aware how my grandparents on both sides of my family, who came from different places in Europe and Russia, had a totally different way of speaking. And I would imitate them to the amusement of my parents. And so obviously, I have a little bit of an ear for language anyway, for foreign language. So clearly there's some hard wiring going on that makes dialogue alive in my head. And that is one of the easiest things for me in writing. When I go back and rewrite, of course the writing is always in the rewriting, and I go back and change and fix things, it's usually the dialogue that comes out first best. And I end up leaving most unmolested in second, third, and 15th passes of books.
Mm-hmm. I was noticing years ago in the writings of Hawthorne that he was so good in various other aspects of his writing, but his dialogue just still needs something to this day, obviously, not going to be fixed. What type of voices do you recall any examples of what your grandparents were saying that have stuck with you?
I remember an exchange with my grandmother on my father's side. She was a Holocaust survivor and had a very great regret at being alive. Her entire family was killed, including her twin sister, and she was the only one who survived. And so for as long as I knew her, which was about 35 years, every laugh that she made, anything that gave her pleasure, was always consciously tempered by sadness. So she would laugh, and then at the end of a laugh would be, ha ha ha. Okay. And so it was always my mission when I was around her, my instinct was to want to cheer her up. So sometimes we would be playing gin rummy, which was one setting in which I engaged her and she me. And I remember that I noticed that she was down one day. I don't even know what it was about. It's a long time ago. But I remembered that we were sitting playing cards, and she looked sadder and sadder, and I was trying to think, how can I cheer her up? So I started to whack my own head. And I was pretty bald already, so it made a nice brisk sound. And I kept doing it. I did it harder and harder, and she totally ignored it. Continued to play the cards, and I'm whacking myself until I started to get a headache. I had this big red spot on it. Finally, I whacked myself so hard, she put down the cards, and she looked at me, and she said, "Do you think that I'm an idiot?" With that kind of rhythm of speech, those kinds of things. So in the Max Diamond series, in Diamond Eye, I give him a grandmother. a little Jewish grandmother, and she has my grandmother's exact speech cadence.
Okay.
And I had really a lot of fun writing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. They say that you're supposed to write what you know, and so obviously your interest in martial arts comes into your writing, and you said that motorcycle riding for a long time gave you an impetus to come up with ideas and things. I noticed that in something that you'd said.
There is a meditative quality to long-distance motorcycling. I think that there are a variety of different types of riders. Some are adrenaline seekers and they like speed. I've always disliked speed. This is not to say that I'm immune to the allure of what horsepower feels like in your right hand. But by and large, I tend to follow the adage that anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. So when I'm on a motorcycle, I like to look around. You can't look around if you're going 150 miles an hour. You gotta slow down enough so that if you take your eyes away from the horizon for a moment, you don't run into an 18-wheeler. So to me, when I'm riding, there's a certain, I imagine that if I were hooked up to an EEG, some alpha state would occur after 5 or 10 minutes on the open road. And into that vacuum flows an enormous current of ideas for me. So I always carry a little voice recorder with me when I ride, and I'm always pulling over to the side and I've solved screenplay structure problems with that. I've thought of character ideas with that. I've thought of entire books and movies have come into my head from that. Just take a ride, and things come.
When you're jotting down your ideas like that, do you give enough so that you can remember later? Or?
Yeah, I do, always. It's almost as if there's already some little thing growing, and I need only refer to the seed, and then the rest becomes clear when I go back to it. The martial arts practice, so in terms of riding, if I'm describing, like I did in A Cure for Gravity, if I'm describing a cross-country ride, I really know what it feels like to come out of the mountain that's behind Death Valley in June at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's still dark and have the sun coming up and you're in snow at 5,000 or 6,000 feet, and then it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and the different feeling of the road and the air and the sounds that the bike makes as you go down and the way the note changes in the engine and your hands feel on the bars and all that stuff, until all of a sudden you're in a 120-degree furnace. I've done that more than once, so I know exactly what it feels like to ride. Yeah. Martial arts, it's always been a point of pride to me how infrequently I've had to apply things in real life. I mean, that's a sign to me of a greater skill level than a guy who goes around beating people up. Mm-hmm. So in writing scenes of violence, I know what it feels like, unfortunately, from the few times I've done it, but mostly I take the study of body mechanics and moves, and it's almost like you read about Jackie Chan choreographing his stunts and thinking through each move and knows what everything looks like. But I have that in my head, and so now, of course, because I have no hair, I don't fight guys too much anymore. And when I have the idea that maybe somebody needs a licking, I usually just do it in my head and get it done with that way. Mm-hmm. So I can play that stuff out, and I'm accustomed to doing that pretty accurately now.
Right. You mentioned Jackie Chan with his pugilistic career and this, that, and the other. It's kind of the Buster Keaton of today as far as putting things
even
together.
Physically a little bit on the face.
Yeah, and laying something out methodically, making sure you know everything before you do anything. And that's very much like what a writer has to do in doing sequences and scenes, I would suspect, on that. You write novels, you write the crime novels, literary novels, you write articles. When you are writing, do you think differently? Or do you pretty much have the same approach to doing each task, keeping in mind the limits of each one?
I don't think that writers think differently when they're writing than when they're not writing. I think if they did, they wouldn't be writers. No sane person picks writing as a career. One might pick it as an avocation, but to pick it as a career, you have to pick it because you are driven to do it and you have no alternative. So I don't believe that things change in the way one thinks, but in constructing a certain piece of work, people talk about there being the art and the craft. I always dislike the term craft because I still, after so many years of doing this, maintain a romantic idea about this thing I do. I don't just think that it's a compulsion because of the certain architecture of the neurons in my brain. I mean, it is that, but I don't think it's just that. I think it's a high, lofty, wonderful, marvelous thing to do, and there's nothing I would rather do. People often ask me, what I would do if I won the lottery, and I just look at them and I go, probably write in a bigger house. I wouldn't change anything because it's a very natural thinking process to me, and I do it all the time.
Mm-hmm. When did you know you were going to be a writer?
9.
Age 9?
Yeah, I got a bad report card in 4th grade, and my father took me into his study. That wasn't a good sign, by the way. Being taken into the study was So I sat on a calico couch, and I remember he had a bunch of pipes around.
Uh-huh.
And he held these pieces of paper in my hand, and I'm not entirely sure that my feet even touched the ground on that couch. I was a little boy. And he said, and he read me some devastating excerpts from one or the other of these documents and said, this really won't do. He said, you do this, you're going to be a doorman. We lived in Manhattan in a building that had a doorman. And our doorman was Eddie. Mm-hmm. An Irish guy, when I think, in retrospect, when I think about his good humor all the time, I imagine that he probably had a flask in his pocket, but I didn't know about that when I was a kid. I just thought, Eddie the doorman. Cool job. Helps people, gets to be outside a lot, calls you a cab when it's raining, takes your dog for a walk if you're sick. You order a pizza, Eddie's the one that receives it. I mean, seems like that was a good job to me, but some little instinct, maybe a little homunculus in my ear, told me not to suggest this to my father. Mm-hmm. So, then he went on about how I should do, if I got a better report card the next time, I might be a businessman, I might have ships like his friend has, the shipping line, and I could employ thousands of people, or maybe be a lawyer or a doctor, which is what he was. And I looked at him and I said, I've been reading this book, Ivanhoe. Okay. Now, by the way, parenthetically, I should tell you that I don't think I understand Ivanhoe now, so I can be entirely sure that I didn't understand it at the age of 9, but I was trying anyway. Okay. And I said, by Sir Walter Scott. And, it's a story about a guy that rides around. And I said, that guy who wrote that book, he knows who lives, he knows who's going to die, who's going to get sick, who's going to win, who's going to lose, whose life is going to be a tragedy, who's going to be happy, who's going to get the girl and the treasure and everything. He's like God. Mm-hmm. I want to be him. Mm-hmm. So I knew very early, and my dad remembers that scene. I don't think there was much for him to say after that. It was an astonishing thing from a 9-year-old, as I'm told. Uh-huh. And I imagine if my son said that to me at the age of 9, I would also leave him alone about his report card, but that's when I knew. Uh-huh. Yeah.
A writer being like God, that kind of reinforces the notion that it's a very orderly process, and it's very positive, I would think, in many ways too, because you don't have 80,000 words of disorder. People generally won't tolerate it all that much. So, and generally the outcome is either a tragedy, which is natural for whatever you have, or it's something else that is reasonable anyway. There's that element to that. And the godlike narrator that you also come across, that also kind of comes in with what you were talking about when you were 9 years old, I would think in some respect there. When you got older, when did you first truly know that you were going to produce a book?
I wrote a little book about turtles in my teens, which was just some passion of mine. And then later I rewrote that book in my 20s, and Simon & Schuster published it as a guide to exotic pets. I expanded it to include other exotic animals. But I want to get back to something you said about God and order. I have to take exception to that. I guess I have a different point of view. Although structure is important in any kind of writing, at the same time, the novel is the art form which affords us the greatest opportunity for disorder. You have the greatest amount of latitude in that art form than in anything else I can think about. And I tend to think of God as being the greatest possible master of chaos, not of order. I think of the creative urge as being an unstoppable thing on his part, manifested by every possibility there is, in however many universes there are. So I don't think of godliness as being orderly. I think of it as being consummately disorderly. To include, evil and good and, decrepitude and youth and beauty and everything else that we know there is, and much that obviously we don't know there is. In the writing process, I find that my first impulse is not to craft and create order. My first impulse is to get out raw disorder and then later temper it so that it's readable. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah. What you're needing there as a writer then is to have, for one thing, conflict, because if you have two people wanting the same thing, there's no story. When you have two people opposing each other, then you've got the elements of a story. With that in mind there, I was remembering what John Guelphy had written in his book about formula fiction, referring specifically to crime writing, that it dealt with the exploration of what had gone wrong in a society, like Sherlock Holmes looking at 1890s London, Miss Marple and this, that, and the other. To what extent do you think that is an accurate assessment of what people who tell crime stories or detective stories or whatever?
I would, as is my wont, try to go underneath that to a more fundamental level. I would say, rather than thinking about the forces at work in society, I'd like to think about the forces at work in man. I think in the mind. Maybe what engages me about crime writing, or I don't think of myself so much as a crime author. I think of myself as a mainstream author who writes some crime sometimes, whether it's a series that is in the edge of category fiction, or whether it's putting crime in a literary novel for a certain purpose. What's interesting to me about crime is the urges that people have and engage and indulge. I think as a person and as a writer, I feel as if I am a bit judgmental about people who engage and indulge those urges too much. On the other hand, my reviewers seem to think that I have an unusual ability to suspend judgment of my characters. So maybe this makes some sense. Maybe it's that because I don't judge my characters hardly at all, I present them unjudgmentally just as they are. In order to interject some morality into my work, I have to find some extreme thing. So, in which there's no ambivalence at all on my part or on the part of the reader, hopefully. So, for example, in Diamond Eye, there's kiddie porn and snuff films and a great deal of violence, which was really absolutely devastating for me to write. I mean, it gave me a queasy feeling the entire time I did it. But I did it because I thought, you know, as a series opener, what is the mission of a series opener? A series opener's mission is to establish who is this recurring character. And there could be, at least at the time to me, when I thought about it, no better way to establish who this law enforcement officer was, this postal inspector, than to give him something which I personally found so repellent that I would tap into my own revulsion to reveal myself, of course, through him. And it worked. You know, some people found that part of it hard to read, and I don't blame them because I found it hard to write, but it was very, very effective in revealing this character in a big way in one book. So that I tend to think of crime in those terms. It's very individual.
Okay. I was going to ask you about the pornography element, because that alone could be enough to turn off somebody. Just the fact that you're dealing with it, not the fact that it's being endorsing. So that is a difficult little tightrope to go through. How did you handle that?
Well, you know, when I explored people's notions about what a United States postal inspector did, and indeed when I first heard of the postal inspector inspection service, it had to do with the Unabomber back when. And I'd never even heard of a postal inspector, and I figured that this is a guy who knocks on your door, tells you, you know, you owe 10 more cents on that stamp, on that letter, you know. And when I learned that these were heavy-duty cops, I found it hard to, in talking to people, to shake their idea that this wasn't a serious cop.
Right.
That, yeah, you know, somehow the low rung on the totem pole of cops would be a postal inspector.
Right.
And it's actually not at all the case. So that was another reason for choosing that difficult tightrope. You know, it was such a difficult tightrope that I don't know that I would do it again, but I did it. As far as me dealing with it, during the course of writing it, you know, I woke up a lot in the middle of the night. I mean, in order for me to create some of those scenes, which were so tough, had some cost. And I told myself, rightly or wrongly, that added the energy that I hoped would create that character. So I hope it worked.
Okay.
Yeah.
We look for the magical realism, and also when we look for the crime element of literature, we go back to Genesis. We got the killing of, the incident involving Cain and Abel. Oedipus Rex tries to find out who killed the former king, so it permeates so much of literature. With your writing, what would you advise someone who's just starting out writing to do?
I would advise them to read a lot, widely, voraciously. I would advise them to not think about how to get an agent or how to find a publisher. I would advise them to think about how to write a really good book. First things first.
Okay. This is Howard Denson for Writer to Writer, and we thank you very much for watching.